Welcome to the Microsoft 365 Developer Podcast with your host, Jeremy Thake. Each week, you'll catch us speaking to expert developers about new tech, lessons learned, and opinions in this space. So I'm here with Abram Jackson. Thank you for joining me today, Abram.
Absolutely my pleasure, Jeremy.
I feel like from our replay of the episodes last week of this is our dot again approach with this podcast, you kind of rubbed it in a little bit with, hey, I haven't seen a new episode update for 12 months. And my first reaction was, well, he listens to the show. That's a good thing.
No, I do love this show. I'm very glad that you've restarted it.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like this is a good position to restart it after all the build announcements. And I couldn't think of anything better with the role that you've played on this journey for you to kind of cover the higher level kind of announcements and then like pull in some of the PMs that own specific parts of it to talk in the weeds in the next few months of the show. So yeah, I appreciate you offering to take on this altitude show because obviously it's kind of hard sometimes to understand everything that goes on the left to right on the Copilot platform for sure.
It totally is. You know, we're moving very fast, and I don't envy anybody trying to keep up with all of the announcements and all of the things going on. So I'm very happy to talk about the overview.
And for those that maybe aren't aware of who you are, do you want to just introduce yourself, like how long you've been at Microsoft, what teams you've been on, and what your main focus is at the moment?
Sure. So I've been at Microsoft for 13 years. I started off out of college working on Exchange Server and Exchange Online. Several years ago, I moved into the AI platform space and supporting our internal AI developers, building a lot of the features that you see around Microsoft 365. About a year ago, I began working on Copilot for Microsoft 365 and the third-party developer platform, the capabilities there. So you might have heard us talk last year about building plugins and graph connectors in order to extend the knowledge and enhance the skills of Copilot for Microsoft 365. So that's what I've been doing for just this last 12, 13 months.
With Build last week, obviously this being recorded a little bit before Build, but will be coming out the week after Build. How would you explain at the top level what the key announcements were based on the journey we've had since the last Build in 2023?
So there's a lot of things at Build. A major one that we are talking about is being able to build your own Copilot and have it as an extension to Copilot for Microsoft 365. So a lot of the things that are new and are upcoming are around that space, around building your own Copilot. And in particular, you heard about Copilot Studio and building your own declarative Copilot, which is a configuration-based developer experience to build a full generative AI product involving your software in Copilot for Microsoft 365. But we announced a lot of other things too. We have a lot going on, and I do think about how they build together. So other things that we talked about are many improvements to plugin capability. Plugins are soon becoming available in what we call the sidebar or the app chat experiences in Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and Outlook. So that conversation experience that you can open up on the side of the M365 clients. We're bringing plugins into those places. We're also enhancing the capabilities of plugins pretty significantly by moving beyond just the search and the retrieve information plugins to being able to take action, and of course with user confirmation. So now you can add new records, update, change things from your external system from Copilot for Microsoft 365. We also talked a little bit about building a Copilot from the Teams AI library, which is a little bit farther out, but we intend to work just the same as the Copilots that you build declaratively. In both cases, they are extending Copilot for Microsoft 365 with a full generative AI experience. But in the custom engine Copilot path, with the evolution of the Teams AI library, you get to choose your own model and your own orchestrator, your own hosting platform, but still work in this very powerful custom Copilot way.
Well, that's the show. We can wrap up right there. All the announcements in 4 minutes. And I'd love to unpack all that. So I think starting with like building on top of what we did at Build, and if we think about November and Ignite, and then to now, and it's gone so quick. I was like, I forget that we didn't announce those things at Build 12 months ago, that there were things in an interim 6 months ago that weren't for the Build audience. With plugins, specifically with Copilot Studio, going from just having Teams Toolkit as the option in Visual Studio Code to build plugins to Copilot Studio, where there are 5 different types of plugin shapes that take advantage of the different Power Platform capabilities that have been around for a long time now. What's your take on how you think developers will look to those things? Like what types of developers will go one way versus the other way from the experiences you've had talking? Because I know you talk to a lot of customers and ISVs. What's your take there on that kind of that decision guide between the two?
Well, we often talk about these things as low code and pro code when we're discussing internally. This is a pretty common Microsoft pattern, and we've done things like this for quite a while. So there's, of course, that dichotomy. But I think about it, in terms of who these individuals are that are using these tools primarily. The really awesome thing about Copilot Studio is that it's available for all of the individuals that have the Copilot for Microsoft 365 license. And it is so easy to use. So if you have a technically minded user that maybe they were customizing the prompt, they were doing prompt engineering and learning some of the best practices using Copilot Lab, Copilot Studio is not too much of a stretch beyond that kind of prompt engineering. Really what Copilot Studio allows you to do is it gives you tools and frameworks, yes, but especially it gives you the publishing platform so that your individual users can move beyond just their own system, just their own use, and move beyond to their teams. So that's what I'm most excited about Copilot Studio is, within teams, the technically minded or the interested in AI users creating things that are helpful for the rest of their team members. The pro code path builds on the Teams apps and the other Microsoft 365 app development story that we've had for a very long time of using Visual Studio Code, the Teams Toolkit, the Partner Center and the Unified Application Manifests, integrated with your CI/CD, your bug tracking, your code branches, your repos, your PRs, your issue tracking, all of that stuff. If you were using all of those things, if you know what all of those words are that I just said, right, you're probably interested in the pro code path. And if you've been developing with Microsoft 365 before, as you probably have if you're listening to this podcast, we have not forgotten about you, right? We know that you, the pro code developers, you are continuing to use those tools. Think about Copilot Studio as an additional capability for end users, makers.
Yeah, I think I just come back from the Microsoft 365 community conference in Orlando, and that's a very heavy SharePoint Teams developer shop, but more and more so this year especially, there's a lot of Power Platform developer community there as well. And with Copilot Studio, if you've been building Power Apps, Power Automate flows, Power Platform connectors as part of those things naturally will probably gravitate towards using Copilot Studio because they can leverage all that known technology. And if you're a SharePoint developer that's building SPFX or a Teams developer building things in Teams Toolkit, then the Pro Code Visual Studio area is going to be probably where you start. Well, one thing that did come up when we were initially framing all this with plugins and since last Build was at Build last year we talked about message extension plugins because of the path of the fact that if you're a Teams developer and you've built message extensions for Teams, now those things can be plugins and show up in Copilot for Microsoft 365. But obviously now with the announcement of Build of API plugins, where they don't have to have that flavor of message extensions backed by the bot framework. What's your take on that and why we did that? Why we are providing two flavors of plugin development in the pro code space?
I think about plugins. There's actually several ways to make plugins. Power Platform has 4 different ways to make plugins already, right? And then, yes, there's message extensions, and then there's APIs. But all of these plugins end up with pretty much the same result. And in fact, this is industry standard or just technology standard. Everybody that is developing language model applications and chat applications, not just Microsoft, but anybody that's building chat applications, there's really only two things that you can do. There's kind of three. You can fine tune them. Yes, I'll leave that aside for now. You can add retrieval augmented generation, RAG, by adding more grounding data, usually with a vector database. And you can construct function calls to APIs. Actually, RAG is implemented by constructing function calls also. But for simplicity's sake, the only thing that the language model is doing here with plugins is taking out the APIs and constructing these API calls from them. So Microsoft, around M365, there was two large ecosystems already of APIs. There was the Power Platform connectors, and there's the Teams message extensions, both of which, I don't know, there's thousands or tens of thousands of these APIs already constructed and already defined. But from Copilot's perspective, they work the same. There's the API signature and a description of that API. That description in natural language is very important, but they result in the same thing. So what we're trying to do is take developers that have been working in either ecosystem, and now with just APIs, API plugins, if you've been even just working in web development and all of the APIs that just exist on the internet, what we're trying to do is enable you to take those APIs that you already have and have already developed and turn them into plugins. The intent is not to make one kind better than another or to deprecate one kind, but to give you as many options as possible to meet you where you are, take your existing APIs and turn them into plugins.
Yeah, and I think sometimes we can be scolded at Microsoft for giving choice and not having one option. And I think the luxury that a new company in this space building a development stack, they don't have a lot of the audiences that we do. Like, we're fortunate enough to have these audiences and then trying to have that continuum between one hub platform to another. And, whether it's the Teams ecosystem or the Power Platform ecosystem, giving those options I think has been compelling for us in accelerating what we see in the Copilot developer platform. But I think the API plugins has also then benefited, like, people outside the walls of Microsoft. It's more familiar with them if they just bring their own open API description document and use that as a plugin in a similar way to what we see other platforms doing at the moment.
That's right. If you're developing in Greenfield, right, you can make a lot of progress and a lot of demos. But in enterprise and in B2B, in software, for $1 million software, there's a lot of value in sticking with these ecosystems and building from what we have. Starting over, it would actually take a lot longer.
Right.
If you are building a greenfield new software system, yes, the APIs are simplest. You don't get the additional complexities of Power Platform or the Teams ecosystem, and you can just do RESTful web APIs.
So even things like the conversational plugins being based on the Power Virtual Agent user interface in the Power Platform land, the fact that we're able to accelerate that quickly with that existing tech and make those things plugins as an example, or even the Flow plugins as another example, it just means that people are familiar with those things and can shoot those things off and make them available in Copilot. The interesting thing that you called out was actions as an enhancement of plugins. We had a lot of demand for that from our Cape teams and my CPX team when we were working with enterprise customers and software companies on, look, summarization is great, but we want it to actually do things. Can you explain a little bit about how that works as a generic plugin, regardless of whether it's a ME or an API or a Copilot Studio plugin?
Yeah, that's totally right. And we knew right off the bat, before last build, back last February and the first time that we talked about extensibility, that we need to be able to take action also. Ultimately, you're not getting any useful work done until you've done something with it. Now, oftentimes that's just learn about or write an email about, but many, many times we hear this all over and over from our customers. They need to update that system now that they've done the work, or they've internalized it and now they're updating that external system. And it took a long time to get right. These language models and the way that they can hallucinate or confabulate and be non-deterministic, it's difficult in the enterprise space where mistakes, incorrect data can cost a lot of money. They're actually implemented very similarly. They work the same to the language model as search plugins. So you have an API, you've got a description of the API. But now instead of just being able to search, retrieve, find, summarize those kinds of things that your API was doing, now you can create, update, delete, send, communicate. That allows the user to, of course, continue their workflow with your external software. A lot of, you've probably seen in the demos, if you've watched the videos, that we are showing the user all of the information that is going to be sent and used. And you as a developer have the options of creating a form to fill in, or to allow the user to use natural language to edit the fields that are going to be sent. And then only after they've confirmed does Copilot actually call the API and actually send the data for you to update that system and get that confirmation back.
So there's like that manual intervention that the user has to be, yes, the LLM has made the right assumption of what I asked it to do, and kind of give it permission to do it.
Yeah. And our user researchers, would call this human in the loop. And so we use this so frequently that we've just acronymed it to HITL, where once you realize that's an acronym, you'll start seeing the pattern all over the place in anybody's Gen AI product.
What's interesting, though, is I think in our manifest file where we mark whether we want the human in the loop, it has a very obscure name in the property of the metadata. It escapes me what it is right now, but it always, in all the tutorials I've seen so far,
is consequential.
Is consequential, thank you. Yeah. I feel like human in the loop would have been a much better property for that in the manifest.
I'll take that under advisement.
And I think the actions was the big thing that I think is going to be a major hit here for pushing back in. And part of what you've described on the descriptions of the open API functions that are in the document being so important. Can you just explain like a high level, and obviously it's not easy over audio without hands and a whiteboard, but what the orchestrator does in that action flow to call a function, just to give developers a bit of understanding about like what it's actually doing in that process?
The first thing to realize is if you've played with large language models yourself and APIs, the first thing to realize is Copilot for Microsoft 365 is not a single API call to a language model. In fact, it's a complicated series of calls to a language model. Where first, once the user has typed in something and we filtered it for jailbreaks and so on, the language model first writes to itself an action plan. We call this reasoning. It comes up with several steps that it is going to perform. So that might be, in very simple cases, search the user's email, find the most interesting emails, summarize them, respond in a markdown list, as a very simple example. Part of what reasoning can do is recognize that it needs other information. And in fact, this is nearly always the case. In industry parlance, we'd call this the language models using a tool. So some of these tools are search email, search files. These are the ones that access M365 data. When the user has a plugin enabled, it's adding on more tools into this process of search Jira and whatever your software system is. So that sits right next to search email. So when the language model has a reasoning step where it realizes that it needs to go get external information, there's a few things that need to happen in that sub-step. The first thing that needs to happen is to identify the candidate functions. So you see this in your plugin definition. In the message extension, they are commands. In the API, they are functions. But whatever they're called, they are the specific APIs within your plugin. So first, those need to be selected. Right now, we are selecting the best 3 matches. We're looking to expand that. And we have been doing this based on generally the title matching, where the user has used one of the words of your plugin title. We are working on expanding that. We're running the experiments. We have scientists evaluating expanding that to first a semantic match on the title. That'll be just a little bit useful, but we're expanding that to the semantic match on the function descriptions. So soon we expect that users won't have to be so explicit about your plugin name. And instead, they can just ask for, I'll just keep using the Jira example because we use it all the time. They can just create a ticket without using the word Jira. So those plugins are given as candidates to the language model. Now there's a second language model call for it to, out of the 3 or 5 or 10 function candidates, to generate the parameters necessary for these. So the language model picks from these candidates and fills in all of the properties necessary and returns a completed function call description. Language models can't call APIs themselves, so our service calls that API with the user's token, obviously, depending on how you set up authentication, and returns that data. So just in this one substep of the reasoning plan, the language model might determine that it needs to call multiple different tools. Maybe it needs to search emails and files and your software system. All of these results are then sorted again, and the top 10 of them right now are given back to the language model for it to perform this final step of synthesis. So when the language model gets to its final step of its reasoning plan, it has all of the information. It's got the top 10 emails and files and plugin responses, and determines which of these are going to be most useful to respond back to the user. When it uses them, it includes the citation and the reference. All right, that was fairly complicated.
I'm impressed. No, that was good. I feel like that. I was following along, but again, I've been in this space for a while now. But I do feel like that was a pretty good audio-only version of how that goes through that plan. The other thing that I think is worth calling out is, as you mentioned, it gets referenced as a citation in the response. With the Dash developer on capability in Copilot, you can actually see what Abram has described in a tabular format where it shows you what plugins are enabled for the user, what plugins it's selected to use, and did it actually call those functions within the plugin and what the result was of those calls. And so as a developer, you can kind of troubleshoot at what stage in that process maybe your plugin's being dropped out. And, to Abram's point, there is a lot of work we're doing to continually improve how it matches those plugins and selects them. And, we're after more feedback there. So if you're in this space and you're struggling, please reach out to myself, because I'm actually in charge of all the DevX stuff right now, to try and kind of push those things through and improve that. Now, so that's actions. That's how it works. The sleeper of me, and we're not even at build, but it's a sleeper internally, but I predict it's going to be a sleeper at build too. So when you watch the show, leave me totally wrong or totally right, is app chat and this notion of Copilot living in Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Outlook, and plugin capability there. What can you do in those Copilots, not in the main Copilot for Microsoft 365, but in the Copilot lives in those Office clients? Can plugins work? What are you able to access from a developer perspective there?
So it was last month or so, we announced, what did we call it? Like graph grounding in Copilot for Word, something along those lines. What that meant was in that chat experience, you can now search for your email and your files and your Teams chats and the rest of your M365 data, in addition to just chatting with the language model. So we're putting plugins there. That's important. And that is the idea, that we are trying to make Copilot for Microsoft 365 not just feel like the same product, but really be the same product. So when customers have enabled, installed plugins, and also copilots, whether they're declarative or custom engine, they'll also be working in the sidebar experiences, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Outlook, and hopefully other clients in the future. So you can do all of the things, and these teams like to talk about being a superset of the full page experience, which is accurate. It can do all of the things that the full page experience at copilot.microsoft.com or Bing or Microsoft365.com/chat or in Teams can do. It can do all of that stuff because now we are adding the plugin capability. It can already use the graph connectors. We'll be rolling out the declarative copilots capability there also. But also, these copilots or Copilot for Microsoft 365 in the sidebar experiences can interact with what we call the canvas, which is just the open application. So when you're in Word, Copilot for Microsoft 365 can summarize that document. It can add a paragraph to that document, and so on. As a developer, you don't have direct access to be able to do that yourself through a plugin or through a declarative Copilot, but you can get that information to the user, and the user can prompt, get this information from external software and insert it. So they are instructing Copilot in this sidebar experience to interact with the Word document or the PowerPoint or the Excel or whatever, including the information from your external software system. And we think of that because as natural language and the users being descriptive about what they want to do, you as an external software developer are unlikely to know what the user is going to want to do out of the 1,000 different things that a user can do in Word or in Outlook.
Yeah, I think this is, taking what was done with Word add-ins and Outlook add-ins and so forth, where you were really building user interface task panes on the right-hand side or buttons and ribbons to do individual discrete tasks, and open this up to, natural language queries, but essentially backing it by the data in your service to, manipulate the canvas, whether it's a Word document or a PowerPoint doc or an Excel doc. And I'm really excited to see that convergence of Office developers that we've had for a long time in VSTO and COM add-ins in the past to this new future with, being AI powered with Copilot and extending those with plugins. So if you have any cool demos, please reach out. I'd love to showcase them and get the attention they need, because I think there's going to be some really exciting things happening in that space from a developer community that we've had for a long, long time. So that brings us to the last area, which is kind of the handoff to copilots, whether they're declarative or they're custom engine copilots. How would you frame what a declarative copilot is to people listening?
So I think about this whole space as building on top. You have APIs and you have data. Behind your APIs, there's several different mechanisms that we have to support you in hosting those APIs. There's the different kinds in Power Platform, whether it's a conversation or a prompt or a flow. Ultimately, they are an API. And then there's information that we support through Copilot connectors that we've been talking about as graph connectors, and Power Platform will participate in as well, which is grounding information. So we've had those two things, and we've talked about them, and we'll keep making them better, plugins and connectors. We're adding a third primitive called instructions, model instructions, system prompts sometimes, whatever you want to call it, as a third thing that you can build. The instructions alone, they can do a couple of things. They can flavor the Copilot to sound a little bit different. You can do those kinds of things. You can have it talk like a famous historical individual, or as a technology company executive, or as a coach or a teacher. But when you combine that with the other primitives into a declarative Copilot, when you combine those instructions with plugins or connectors, you get something that's quite a bit more powerful. So declarative copilot is a combination of the instructions, and I would suggest at least either more grounding information from Graph Connectors and SharePoint sites or from plugins. Then what you can do with the instructions is not just sound like a famous historical person, but describe the user's intents, their workflows, or their job. So we talked a lot about at Build about Copilot for Sales as a major product for Microsoft. So I'll just talk about that one because I'm very familiar with it. But Copilot for Sales builds into their instructions the kinds of jobs that salespeople have to do. They've got to generate leads. They have to follow up on leads. They have to get deals made. They have to close. I'm not actually an expert on exactly what salespeople do, but the developers of Copilot for Sales are. So you can put in these instructions this kind of information, and this can guide Copilot into those sales workflows. That a useful way to think about these instructions are you are doing the prompt engineering instead of the user. So as much time as we've spent over the last 12 or more months talking to users about being better prompt engineers, we've made some progress. The instructions of declarative copilots allow you to be prompt engineers. And you can test, develop, debug, see how good they are, change, check in, change track your instructions, which are effectively the prompts. So when you've combined these different primitives, the grounding data, the APIs into plugins, and instructions, now you have an entire chat product that you've developed, leveraging all of the technology of Microsoft and of our OpenAI and partners to build an incredible experience to help users with their specific scenarios, what their workflows and what their jobs are. Because you in the ecosystem listening to this, right? You know your users and you can tailor to your users better than anything that I could ever build, that Microsoft could ever build.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be the bit that unlocks the ecosystem, whether you're an enterprise dev building line of business things for internal business processes, or if you're an ISV and you're building these things generically for your 2,000-3,000 customers that you're already selling to with other products on our platform. So I'm really excited to see what people do with declarative copilots and like the immersive experience you get in launching one of those, and the brand you can have around the name and the icon, I think also adds to it in a way that we didn't provide with graph connectors and plugins. But I think, all of those things we've talked about today so far have been about, primitives building on our stack. You're using our LLM, using our orchestrator, you're kind of on rails of the platform. But then there is this additional approach, which I think is great that we're providing, again, more choice, that if you want to bring your own LLM and you want to bring your own orchestrator and your own AI stack, you can do that through custom engine copilots. And how do you see the difference there between what you've just described with plugins, graph connectors, and declarative copilots as primitives versus like this notion of handing off to a copilot with custom engine copilots?
Well, your job as a custom engine copilot developer is actually the same. You still need to identify your grounding data. You need to get it into a vector database. You need to define your APIs and tools, and you need to define your system prompt. So you have the same primitives. Your job is still the same, but what you don't have, or I guess what you do have, is you get the option to use your own model and your own orchestration technology. So you can decide that yours is not going to work like Copilot, for instance. So as a silly example, maybe this is a real scenario, maybe not. Copilot always responds once to the user. It won't come back alive in a half hour and say, "Hey, are you still there?" It can't do that because it's always reactive. If you're using your orchestrator, that you could change that. Please don't annoy our users, right? But if you've got a good reason to come back and send a second message to the user after an hour, you get that kind of capability. The other thing with custom engine copilots is it leverages so many of the team's constructs of notifications, the toasts, the tabs, the bars, the commands, these capabilities. So especially if you already have a very robust Teams bot and you've already been building generative AI into it, or if you already have a generative AI chat product in your own experience or in other experiences, we're hoping to make it easy for you to bring those to Copilot for Microsoft 365 also.
And how will those show up? Like, how is the way you interact with those within Copilot for Microsoft 365? Is there any major differences between the declarative Copilots and these custom engine Copilots?
So declarative engine Copilots, right, as an evolution of Teams bots, they work, in the user experience like Teams bots do. So that's foremost. So they are in the chat list, for instance, and also they can be pinned to the app bar and things like that. Another thing that we've been talking about and we've announced recently is that you can now deep link into these custom engine Copilots. In particular, what we have shown is doing so from a plugin. So the user's made a query. Copilot has used a plugin in your application. You've returned an adaptive card. And your adaptive card now has a button that says, continue the conversation in my product name assistant. If the user clicks on that, the users, if they weren't already in Teams, Teams opens, the conversation can continue from the context history with your custom engine Copilot.
Yeah, and I think that's going to really unlock some amazing scenarios, and a lot of the reasons you said why they're, again, goes back to that choice. We're giving you choice. If you come from a certain path, we want you to be in our ecosystem no matter which path you've come from. I understand it, there's a breakout that me and Barnum do at Build that talks about the different choices and which way is stronger than the other. And I think this podcast, you've done a really good job of giving your own opinions on it, which does align with what we're doing. And I'd recommend checking out that developer guide session at Build if you haven't seen it already. What would be your final parting take on this? I know you, for those that aren't following Abram on LinkedIn, Abram and Twitter, Abram does share a lot about just the AI space in general. And I think you're one of the folks in our group that does a good job of trying to keep us, realistic on the Microsoft way of doing things and what the rest of the industry is doing and matching between what's out there and what we do. What would be your final take for people that are in the AI space? They're, interested in doing development. How would you try to focus people to keep an eye on what's going on out there, and what resources do you use to do it?
Well, this space is moving so fast. And we're not so used to doing that in B2B, in enterprise. And, Microsoft has a reputation of not moving so fast. I think we are trying to change that reputation in this language model and generative AI space. So it is absolutely a balance of these things that are new and they're coming out. Every single week, you'll see posts about the 10 announcements that will totally blow your mind. It's now a meme about how many people are just reposting the same announcements. What we're trying to do at Microsoft and at Microsoft 365 is identify what's really valuable there in the business and the enterprise space. For productivity, for knowledge workers, for information workers, that's just people that work with computers, really, and attach them to our software partners, our ecosystem partners, you all listening to this. We know at Microsoft that we don't have all of the enterprise software, but hopefully the people listening to this do and can. So we want to give you the best options to connect your software systems into the best and fastest moving generative AI that we're finding is durable, lasting value for our joint customers.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see. I think this pace isn't going to slow down anytime soon. And there's a lot of competitors and allies out there, working in this space. And I'm really excited to see how we can keep an open platform that allows us to kind of cooperate with the openness of the AI space, as well as kind of accelerate and I guess have some innovation that we bring to the space ourselves with the power of what we have in our existing platform and the data that we have within Microsoft 365. So yeah, I'm really excited to see what happens in the next 6 months post all these announcements we've had at Build, honestly.
Yeah, if you're listening to this, you already know the power of Microsoft 365. I assume. So you know how many joint customers you have with us if you're an ISV, right? Or how your company uses so much of Microsoft 365, perhaps you do personally, right? We want to be, the best place for you to integrate, to have lots of customers, lots of your team members, your fellow employees, to get the generative AI value connected to your software systems, your data, your actions, your capabilities, and your knowledge about workflows.
Well, I appreciate you taking time so close to build as we're recording this before build. I know I'm busy. I know you're really busy. So thank you for taking time to talk us through that. And we'll definitely get you back on the show in the future as well.
Always a pleasure. You let me know when, Jeremy.
And I'll make sure in the show notes that we have all the links to your Twitter and your LinkedIn handles, because you are doing some great work there, just sharing the information you're finding around the web too.
Well, thank you very much, Jeremy. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Thanks for listening to the Microsoft 365 Dev Podcast. Check out our show notes on www.m365devpodcast.com and follow us on X at M365devpodcast. We'd really appreciate it if you could give us a review on Apple Podcasts too. That's all, folks.